Welcome to Leadership Reimagined, where game-changing conversations are reshaping the world of work. I'm Janice Ellig, CEO and founder of Ellig Group, executive search advisors, pioneers in redefining executive search through our unwavering commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today on Leadership Reimagined, our topic is the CEO's job, be a compass, not a GPS. And I am delighted to welcome Ken Frazier, co-chair of OneTen and the former CEO and chair of Merck & Company, which a position he held for over a decade. Ken is also chairman Health Assurance Initiatives at the venture capital firm General Catalyst, where he advises on investments and partnerships and provides mentorship to founders building companies that are well-positioned to transform the healthcare industry through collaborative and responsible innovation. Ken is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Business Council, the Council of the American Law Institute, the American Bar Association, and a fellow of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Additionally, Ken is co-chair of the Legal Services Corporation's Leaders Council. And Ken has been named by Fortune magazine as one of the world's 50 greatest leaders. So I am really delighted, Ken, to welcome you today to our podcast, and it's truly an honor to have you on the program.
Janice, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to having a good and productive conversation.
Well, I always like to start with getting to know the person. So getting to know the person, Ken Frazier, and then we'll go into Ken Frazier, the CEO. So you have a very interesting personal story of growing up in Philadelphia during the Civil Rights Movement. You were part of the school disintegration movement. You lost your mother at the age of 12, and you were raised by your father, who I know you admire greatly. And he had just a third grade education and worked as a janitor. So these are a lot of challenges, and I wanted to know how these circumstances shaped you, the decisions you've made in your personal and your professional life.
Well, let me start by saying that I was blessed to have really great parents who, in fact, made me believe that anything I wanted to do, I could do if I was willing to work hard. And so, although there were some societal challenges from time to time, I have to say the most important thing was to be raised in a house where people had high expectations and strong beliefs in my own ability. You mentioned that I did come up during the period of time of the Civil Rights Movement. And one of the things that mattered the most to me in the long run was that Philadelphia was then engaged in a little bit of a social experiment, which was called school desegregation. And so my younger sister and I, who were the youngest two of our siblings, we were given the opportunity, and I put opportunity in quotes, to get on a bus early in the morning and go across town to be educated in schools that were outside our neighborhood. So we didn't get to hang out with our friends. But looking back at that time period, I realized that the quality of the education that I got, the rigor of the education that I got, the breadth of the education that I got was much different than my older siblings who got to go to school in our neighborhood with our friends. And so, one of the issues we have in this society around opportunity is around education, which I believe is the great equalizer in society. And for many parents, their ability to furnish that kind of education to their children is a function of their ability to purchase or obtain real estate that is proximate to where the good schools are. In my case, I got to ride buses across town, and I'm only here today, I believe, because I had that opportunity, that educational opportunity.
So your older siblings did not have that, correct? I mean, it was you and your younger sister that had that opportunity.
Yes, that's right. My older siblings, they did okay in life, but they went to the schools that were, again, in our neighborhood. And I was able to go to better schools just because of where I fell in the birth order. And so one of the things that I think about and I try to remind people about in our society is that it's so important for every child to get the kind of education that allows him or her to achieve their full potential. In my case, being bused from the inner city to better schools was part of a school program, but it should be available to every child.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in terms of what you're doing now in terms of trying to ensure that. So, your father was a major influence on you, and you speak about him with great admiration because there was something in his life. Jackie Robinson's story really impacted him. How did he take what he knew in life and from his own father into what he imparted to you as a person, as a leader?
So let me go backward a little bit. My paternal grandfather, Richard Frazier, was born into slavery in 1857, which is unusual for someone who's here having this conversation. My dad was born in the year 1900. His father sent him north when he was 13 or 14 years of age because his father didn't want my dad to become indebted to the land. In other words, becoming a sharecropper like he was. And so my father lived his entire life in great gratitude to his father for making available to him the opportunity to have a life very differently than someone would have as a tenant farmer or as a sharecropper. The point about Jackie Robinson was that Jackie Robinson broke the so-called color line in 1947, and my father was 47 years of age at that point. So he had lived in this country for a half a century before that occurred. He viewed that as a very seminal moment in America because Jackie Robinson was able to uh, integrate baseball, break the color line, so to speak. But the most important thing about Jackie Robinson was that he excelled at what he did. So he broke the color line. He became a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. His first year, he was Rookie of the Year. His third year, he was most valuable player in all of baseball. So my father used Jackie as an exemplar of what he believed, which was that despite all the barriers that one might face based on race, if one wanted to excel and was willing to do the hard work to excel, that one could, in fact, be successful. So those Jackie Robinson stories that we heard over the dinner table were intended to fortify our intention to go out in the world and to achieve things.
Kudos to your father for what he did and imparted to you. So that took you to Penn State and a law degree from Harvard, but then you returned to Philadelphia where you practiced law on civil rights. And I understand you really loved being in front of that jury, being a jury trial lawyer. And so tell us about some of those early days and again, how you sometimes pictured your father in that jury box in defending some of those cases in civil rights. And one was a very famous one was the Bo Cochran, an inmate on death row for 19 years.
So let me start by saying that I think one of the benefits that I had as I became a jury trial lawyer was that because my father didn't have a formal education, but was one of the brightest, uh, learned people that I knew that there was a big difference between intelligence and formal education. And I found that as a jury trial lawyer, many lawyers who are, of course, well educated didn't really understand how to talk to juries because they assumed that because people didn't have the same level of formal education, that they were incapable of understanding concepts or issues. I knew that that wasn't true. And I think it really helped that I was able to communicate with jurors based on my experience growing up on the other side of the tracks, so to speak. And as I started taking on those cases, and by the way, I didn't do only civil rights work because when I graduated from law school, I had huge student loans. I joined a large Philadelphia law firm that actually spent a significant amount of its time doing civil rights work. So I got the benefit of working for a large corporate law firm, but being able to do those civil rights cases. And, it really helped a lot was that the partners in the firm were willing to allow me to, as a very young lawyer, try cases in front of juries. I found that I was pretty good at it, frankly, and I got some positive verdicts, at least early on. That might have been by luck, but if you succeed at the beginning of something, you begin to think that you can do it, and that encouraged me to continue to do those kinds of cases. And I had the greatest amount of, I have to say, self-fulfillment from those cases, and in particular, the death penalty case that you made reference to, Bo Cochran's case.
Well, being lucky is just as good as being smart, right? So
Absolutely.
but you You laughed, and I will attribute part of this to your lovely wife, Andrea, who I've met, instrumental in you leaving the practice of law to join Merck, who was one of your clients, in 1992. And you went into many line positions before becoming the CEO and a member of the board in 2011. But you were only one of 5 African American CEOs, I think, at that time. So, how did your position as a minority impact how you led Merck at that time, a 125-year-old company?
Well, that's actually a very complicated question, but I'll try to answer it by saying this. Even going back to when I became a lawyer in a large law firm, one of the things that I really learned very early on was that I had to work very hard to overcome the fact that many of the people that were my clients then and my colleagues at Merck weren't necessarily interested in understanding where I came from or who I felt like I was. And so, it's not necessarily a fair thing, but as an African American lawyer seeking to get clients, and then later on as a person looking to move up the corporate ladder, so to speak, I worked very hard to create a situation where people felt comfortable with me. That was something that I felt like I needed to take on because all of those jobs, whether it's being a lawyer or being a business person, what really matters is that you can have the kind of trust and confidence around you, or the people around you have trust and confidence in you that allows you to move up the chain. And so for me, I was always aware that I was different. I think I know I was the first African American in senior management in Merck when I was brought in to the company in the early 1990s. But I worked very hard again to create that aura of comfort, trust, and confidence that allowed me to move forward. And I'm not saying again that that's the fair thing. It just happened to be the reality.
And so you faced the reality, and you were going to work hard as your dad did, and you were going to build that trust. And you've mentioned, in your time at Merck, the concept of the corporate soul. So what did that mean to you at Merck, and how did you bring that to life while you were the leader there?
Well, let me start by saying that what I'm referring to when I talk about the corporate soul is a real sense of purpose that animates the people inside the company. The company is actually made up of a bunch of very dedicated people. And at Merck, the essence of that corporate soul is the company's intent to translate cutting edge science into medically important products, that is, medicines and vaccines that make a difference in the world, and to put patients first. That really goes back to our modern day founder, George W. Merck, who in the early 1950s was on the cover of Time magazine because he gave a medical school graduation speech in which he said, "Medicine is for the people, not for the profits." And every Merck employee knows that speech by heart, and they take that speech as their guiding star. So it would be a little bit incorrect for me to say that I drove that sense of corporate soul. It was my job to keep reinforcing it all the time. Um, and I tried to do that every day that I came into the workplace, particularly as the CEO. But coming back to the concept of corporate soul, what I'm basically saying is that companies are successful in large part because they have a real sense of purpose. They have values. And those are values that the people of the company make real or don't make real. Fortunately, in Merck's case, Merck people live those values every day.
Do you think it's harder today, given the complexity of the world and leadership and what's demanded in companies, to really drive that corporate soul, that purpose? I see it with Merck, you've got patience, but as a leader, and you've worked with many leaders, do you think it's more difficult today?
I do think it's more difficult. And I think it starts with the fact, going back to the concept of trust and confidence, that the public has less trust in leaders than they ever had before. Whether we're talking about political leaders, religious leaders, social leaders, business leaders, there's a lot less trust in our society than there ever was, at least in recent years. You can talk about all the sources of that, but we see that people, frankly, don't believe what they're being told by people who are in positions of leadership, and it's very hard to create that sense of confidence and trust and belief because people are reading all kinds of things on the social media, all kinds of cynicism and criticism. It's just, I think, it's much of a harder thing to do today to be in that position of authority or responsibility or leadership.
I think it was an Edelman survey that said that's true. People are not trusting in their government. They're not trusting in so many different venues, but they probably look to their company CEO for that voice. So when should they act on societal issues? I mean, you've argued, and I quote, for business to succeed, we need a climate conducive both to people and to commerce that's based on fundamental principles. When government officials either abandon or fail to support those principles, it is the responsibility of citizens to act, and CEOs are among the most influential citizens. So, sounds like the voice of the CEO is important. So when should they be speaking up, Ken?
Well, these are difficult issues today because, again, we live in an extremely divided society. And whenever CEOs decide to speak on social issues in particular, they know that essentially half the population will greet what they say with favor and the other half will be unhappy with what they say. And so, what I've often said is that CEOs have to be very careful about when they want to enter into these kinds of public discussions. I never thought it was my job as the CEO of Merck to tell my people or other people what to think about political issues. But from time to time, there were important social issues. And I tried to ask myself, first of all, whether speaking up was consistent with the company's values, whether I had, in fact, earned the right to speak to those issues because of the company's values, whether or not I thought what I said was going to have some positive influence on the issue. And then lastly, whether or not my board would agree with the fact that I should be using my position to speak to those issues. And when I've had to speak to some difficult issues, I've always gone back to the board or selected members of the board to make sure that I was checking my sensibilities against what the board thought.
So you have a very strong moral compass. Your values were shaped early on. And so you've had to, as CEO of Merck, uh, really navigate some controversial situations. And sometimes those were tough calls, maybe not always popular with the markets, investors, or employees, but they won respect and admiration and backing of your board. So what were some of those crossroads where the buck stopped with you and you had to make that decision?
Well, I would start with one of the first ones that I encountered, which was that when I took over as CEO at the beginning of 2011, the company had in place long-term EPS, earnings per share guidance, in effect, a roadmap that we had given our shareholders about what they could expect, the milestones in terms of increased earnings that they could expect over a 5-year period. When I became CEO, I think about a year and a half of that 5-year period had already elapsed. And so there were 3.5 years remaining. And I did not think staying on that particular EPS roadmap was the right thing for Merck in the long run. So it was 25 days into the job, I remember. I called a special board meeting to share with the board that I had reached the conclusion that it would be in Merck's long-term best interest if I were to withdraw the remaining 3.5 years of that EPS guidance. I should say that statement that I made to the board at the beginning of that call was not greeted with universal acclaim or support. Many of the board members felt that we had made a promise to our shareholders, in essence, that we would be able to stay on that roadmap. But for me, it wasn't the right thing because, among other things, I felt that it would require Merck to do pretty large and indiscriminate cuts in its research budget, which I didn't think was consistent with the company's sense of purpose and its mission, but also thought it was actually going to create a situation inside the company where we would lose our talent. And so I thought I needed to take a stand there. I was uncomfortable. I remember calling my wife when the board went into executive session and saying, I don't know how this is going to turn out. But fortunately, the board was willing to give me an opportunity to do something that I strongly believed in, even though in the short run, it was not something that the investors liked. It really did hurt the stock price. But I think in the long run, I think most people would say it was the right decision for someone who was the CEO of Merck, given the fact that Merck sees itself as a science-based company.
Sometimes you have to take the short-term hit for the long-term gain.
It's easier said than done, though, I have to say. Looking back on it, it was the right decision. But in the moment, I remember, again, consulting my wife about it and being really worried about how long my tenure would be.
Particularly when your stock uh, decreases like that, your investors are not happy. Your employees aren't happy either. But again, you made a calculated decision, and it turned out to be the right one. And also for patients, right? I mean, taking money away from R&D, your pipeline it would be diminished.
You mentioned employees, Janice, and shortly after we did that, we had to stand and make some pretty tough decisions about the workforce here at Merck. When I look back on my tenure, the thing that I'm least proud of or least happy about was that we ended up over about a 5-year period reducing the workforce by over 30,000 employees. So we maintained our R&D investment, but we couldn't say to our shareholders that we were completely blind to the fact that we needed to run the company in a way that was going to produce value for shareholders. And that required me to do some things that, maybe employees thought it was great in the first instance that we didn't cut our R&D budget. But I know in the subsequent years, there were people who were unhappy that we had to do those kinds of large layoffs. And we ended up, taking about $3.5 billion of cost out over a 2-3 year period. That was also a hard decision to make because it was what was necessary for Merck to be successful in the long run. But those employees who were laid off certainly deserve better.
Yeah, but the CEO role is always fraught with, you know, not necessarily a yes, no answer, here, and you have to walk a line that is going to again for the long term. And in your leadership of this highly complex, highly regulated global company, Merck, you have led the company where you delegated a lot of the decision making to the lower levels, encouraging that line to make those decisions as opposed to it stopping with you. How did you stay abreast of keeping things going and knowing the right decisions were made if you're delegating that down? And again, it's the title of our topic today is, CEO job is to be a compass, not a GPS. So you're giving them guidance, but they're making some of those frontline decisions.
Well, I thought as the CEO of Merck, I needed to be present for a lot of the decisions, even though I didn't need to be the person who made the final decision. Ultimately, in a company like Merck, our business model is one in which the value is predominantly created in research and development. A huge amount of the value gets created at the very beginning of the process when we select targets and validate those targets to go forward with our R&D program. That requires a great deal of scientific insight. I happen to be a lawyer by training. And so, again, fundamentally, the most important decisions that are being made in research and in clinical development are being made by physician scientists who have those kinds of insights. So my job was to set the direction of the company, the strategic direction of the company, to allocate resources so that, for example, we always had enough money to pursue the most important opportunities we had in research. And then importantly, and I think this is probably the most important thing, to make sure that I had the right people in the right jobs so that they could actually make those decisions. I needed to stay abreast of those decisions, understand how decisions in one part of the company would affect another company because we were a large global interdependent company. But I ultimately believe very strongly that this notion of, the pyramid where the decisions are made at the top was really the wrong one for an innovation-based company like Merck because the world is always changing. And we see that now. Biology is changing, medicine is changing, technology is changing. The person in the org chart who was farthest from the customer was me. The person who was farthest from the manufacturing line was me. The person who was farthest from the research bench was me. So I didn't want to be the person dictating those decisions when I actually believed that people who are closer to it should make those decisions. Now, often in corporate life, people are sort of conditioned to look up to their boss to make a decision. And so one of the things that I often would say is if I could do only one thing at Merck, and only one thing, it would be to make sure that Merck people had the confidence to make the decisions because they already knew what the right decisions were, generally speaking. So that's what I mean about being a compass, saying we're going to go in this direction. We're going to do R&D. We're going to focus on cancer. We're going to make sure that we bring forward medicines that make a big difference to people around the world. That's the compass. Now, what are the particular targets we're going to pursue? What are the indications within each drug that we're going to pursue? How do we bring them to market around the world? Those were decisions that had to be made by people who had much more insight, expertise, and proximity to those decisions than me. And I was totally comfortable with that.
Well, you said leadership is a team sport. And when a company is successful, the CEO gets credit for what I call the big moments, but leadership is in the many small, quiet moments with a team. So this is your leadership team that you developed and you entrusted with those decisions. And I love what you're saying about you can't always look to the CEO. What does he or she think? It has to be with those who are really expert in their areas. So how did you select those executives, develop people to be the best that they could be in those roles?
Well, first of all, I would say that I always, when I had an important decision to make about a senior position, I tried to take in as much intelligence as I could from the outside world and the internal world. I never thought my judgments, my tastes would necessarily be infallible or correct. And so, for example, I'll use during my tenure, one of the most important decisions I made was I made the decision to bring in a new head of research and development from outside the company. Um, that person's name was Roger Perlmutter, and he did an exceptional job, particularly in developing Keytruda, our big drug for many kinds of cancers. But I wasn't a scientist. Once again, I wasn't in a position to evaluate, which scientists would be necessarily the right one. So I developed a kitchen cabinet. I went to uh, Roy Vagelos, who hired me many years ago in the early 1990s, who is a world-class scientist and a world-class CEO. And with his help, we put together a kitchen cabinet of people who would help me figure out who the right person was. It actually turns out one of the members of that kitchen cabinet was Roger Perlmutter himself. And he ultimately was the candidate that we brought in to do it. But I use that as an exemplar that the best way to pick people I picked Rob Davis as my CFO, and he's now become my successor as CEO. And again, I did exactly the same way. I went around to people in the investment community, other people who were financial luminaries, people who had been senior finance people inside Merck, including Judy Lewent, who was the CFO when I first joined. And I asked them, if you were me and you were looking for somebody to be the next CFO of Merck, give me some ideas about who you would choose. And I'm quite sure that those lists were more thoroughly and effectively curated than any list that I could have come up with by myself.
So you rely on the input of others, and it's a really combined decision in terms of looking for the best leader internally and externally.
Yes. And ultimately, when I say it's a team sport, the success that Merck had, and I get a lot of credit for it, is the success of those individuals that we brought in. I always say that CEOs get a lot of credit for when things go good and they get a lot of blame when things go bad. And I certainly think we deserve the blame because we put those teams in place. But when it comes to the credit, I call that the narrative fallacy, that somehow the CEO gets total credit for the work that's being done, particularly in a company that's an innovative product development company. At the end of the day, what matters were the choices that were being made in the research labs that came forward with important medicines like Keytruda or vaccines like Gardasil.
Well, Ken, you also had a diverse team and you also had a very diverse board. And at the Women's Forum 2021 Breakfast of Corporate Champions, you were honored with the Muriel Siebert Award, the one company and CEO that's really exemplified, having greater diversity on their board and walked the talk a lot. And you also, at that same breakfast, I remember when Andrew Ross Sorkin, our moderator, asked the CEO panel, do women on boards really make a difference to the bottom line? And you responded, Andrew, have you ever measured homogeneity? And also you reminded him that you were one of only 5 Black CEOs. Um, so what are those challenges? I mean, today we have companies on average about 33% of the S&P 500 have gender parity. You're way above that. And diversity overall is increasing, but not at a great pace. So what does one do? What are some of the solutions you think that should be out there to really greater diversity in the boardroom as well as, I might add, the C-suite?
So let me start by saying that the whole issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion right now has become a huge political football in our country. Um, and to take a step back, one of the unfortunate things about our country is that we seem to turn every question into a political debate between people on extremes, one side or the other. And that leaves very little room for rational debate and rational discussion. And diversity, equity, inclusion is one of those discussions right now that I fear has gone off the rails and has gone into that political realm where people are not able to make sensible judgments. Let me start by saying that I think one of the greatest strengths of our society is its diversity. We're a diverse country. Let's use a word that we would use outside the context of this discussion. We're a pluralistic country. We say e pluribus unum, meaning out of many, one. That has always been what's made America great, is that we've been able to bring the best from all around the world. And that's the concept that I think that you want to have. At the end of the day, the strength of a company that has openness to all kinds of people is that they're able to recruit, retain, promote the strongest people there are, irrespective of gender and irrespective of race or religion. And that's our goal. The challenge today is that often people say, well, if you're focusing on diversity, then you must be lowering standards. You must be bringing women or African Americans or whatever, Hispanics or whatever, into your company at the expense of merit. And I think that we have to be a country where we can balance equal opportunity, diversity, equity, and inclusion on the one hand, and allow people to be successful based on their achievements and their merits. I don't think those two things are in any way inconsistent with one another. I think the challenge is, at the end of the day, you want the kind of diversity programs that bring in the best talent from whatever source. And you don't want diversity programs that, for example, provide quotas, because if you provide quotas, you're actually not bringing in all the talent you can bring in from another source. So it's all about openness to the greatest amount of talent. So when we see companies that have almost no women on boards or in the senior management, I can't say that those companies are actively discriminating, but they ought to challenge themselves. That was the point I was making to Andrew's question when he said, please give me briefly, I think his question was, give me, Ken, the business case for diversity. And my point was, no one's ever been asked to make the business case for homogeneity. That's the norm in our society. And so when you say, I want to bring a diverse team in, then you have to overcome some people's concept that the only way in which you can achieve that diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, et cetera, thinking patterns, et cetera, is by lowering standards. And I don't believe that's the case.
Well, as a search firm that focuses on changing that landscape in corporate America, I can tell you that with 80% of our placements being women and underrepresented, we have great candidates on that slate who are, Caucasian men as well. Our clients just happen to pick the most outstanding, who happen to be women and underrepresented groups, because if you keep fishing in the same ponds, you're going to get the same backgrounds. And I think leveling the landscape is to change that balance, because we do not have enough women. We do not have enough diverse candidates in all levels. And so I hope we don't continue with this argument. We just continue to show that the great people from all levels and all walks of life can hold great positions. And it's a matter of access, isn't it? Giving people the opportunity through education and other means to have access to those opportunities. So I want to turn a little bit to your role as co-chair and co-founder of OneTen and what you're doing there. This coalition which is committed to upskilling, hiring, and promoting 1 million Black individuals into family-sustaining careers over the next 10 years. And you've got a great coalition of members with you, like Accenture, Chubb, Delta, IBM, and numerous others. So tell us a little bit about this organization, what you're trying to do, again, changing that landscape.
So OneTen got its origins or its beginning shortly after the whole George Floyd murder, where many companies were asking themselves in good faith what it is that they could do to try to address the kind of racial inequities that have gone on in this country for a long time, for centuries. And initially, the goal of OneTen was to try to close the opportunity gap that exists for African Americans in this country, particularly focusing on people who lack a 4-year college degree. And we've been able to hire roughly 110,000 people into family sustaining wage jobs. That's roughly $50,000 or more, who lack a 4-year degree. Now, we focused initially on African Americans because, based on the census, something like 3 out of 4 African Americans at age 26 lack a 4-year college degree. But it's also half the American population lacks a college degree. So it was always my position that whenever you remove a barrier, an unnecessary barrier, like necessarily a 4-year degree for a job that doesn't really require 4-year degrees, that should be a skills-based job. If you remove it for African Americans, you're removing it for everybody. And that was always our point. Following the Supreme Court case this past year in the admissions context, we took steps to make that even clearer, because now we make it abundantly clear that while the rationale for creating OneTen in the beginning was to close the opportunity gap that exists for Black talent, we're open to helping anybody who needs our help. And so we're not in any way excluding others. And again, coming back to the point, I sometimes use the analogy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which required, for example, when you walk around Manhattan, you now see cutouts in the curb for people who have wheelchairs to be able to go across the intersections. But if one stands on the corner and looks at who actually takes advantage of those, you'll see people pulling luggage and pushing baby strollers, able-bodied people. We make it easier for them to traverse the streets of Manhattan. So my point is that, again, while this initially was about providing more opportunity to deserving people who happen to be African American, by companies looking, and what we've done is we've helped companies look at their own hiring criteria and decide which jobs actually required a 4-year degree. And when those companies make a decision that a particular job doesn't require a 4-year degree, again, it doesn't require that 4-year degree, not just for African Americans, but for all applicants.
You're absolutely right. There's a couple of people I've placed that did not. One is a CEO of a small bank who does not have a college 4-year degree, and exceptional person. It does benefit all of us. What can this audience do to help in the effort of OneTen?
Well, I think so. First of all, anyone who's listening who is in a position of responsibility as a CEO or CHRO or someone else who's responsible for human capital, I say that what we've tried to do is get companies to look carefully at their jobs and make a decision about which of those jobs really require a 4-year degree and which jobs don't require a 4-year degree. The reality of the world is, just as diversity is a reality of our society, the reality of our society is there are some 10 or 11 million jobs that are unfilled, skilled jobs that we can't fill today. And I think if we are not able to develop and train and hire and promote and upskill Americans into those jobs, it won't make our country successful and it won't make our company successful.
So, Ken, there's so many things I wanted to speak to you about, like immigration and education, but we'll have to hold that for another time. You have had so many honors, accolades, been recognized, but I understand Andrea, your wife, again, of 40 years, a fabulous woman. Actually, I think she was in my career at one point in terms of recruitment in the legal area. You shared that she's the person who has kept you humble, and Ken Frazier, the person, rather than Ken Frazier, the CEO. Why? How has she done that? And why is it imperative for a CEO to have an Andrea to keep their self esteem in check?
Well, I will say that of all the things, of all the blessings in my life, the most important decision I made at any place was the decision I made about a life partner. And Andrea has been that life partner. She's honest, she's compassionate, but not too compassionate. She's empathetic, but not too empathetic. She's honest, and she reminds me that, the time that I spend trying to go up the success curve in terms of corporate America is all well and good, but the most important thing is how I'm viewed by others. Am I viewed as kind and thoughtful? Have I done the right thing by others around me, including my family? And on the issue around humility, she's very good at pointing out my self importance. In fact, her classic line to others is that I should be treated for a condition that she calls chronic high self esteem. Uh, and she's right. And so having her remind me of that is useful.
Well, she's a fabulous woman, and I know a fabulous partner. Um, Many of this you have deserved. So I would ask, what is next for Ken Frazier going forward? What else do you want your legacy to be? And any parting words you have for our audience on leadership or any topic?
Well, let me just say that I'm at a stage now where um, I feel like I've accomplished what I wanted in the business world. Uh, I'm hoping that I can get off that track or that arc and get onto another arc, which is really about contributing to others and helping others. And that's what OneTen is about. My wife and I are very involved in Philadelphia on issues of nutrition and health. Philadelphia happens to be the poorest of the top 10 most populous cities. And there's a huge amount of work we can do. Life expectancy in the inner city of Philadelphia is 20 years less than it is in adjoining neighborhoods, largely because of cardiovascular, metabolic, kidney disease, and things of that nature. So I feel like there's an opportunity to do a lot of good for a lot of people. And then your final question about leadership, I would only say a few things about that. Number one is I think it's important that people not get obsessed with their own personal leadership, but try to think about whether or not they are creating genuine value for other people in the world. I think it's very important if you want to be a leader that you're open to uh, constructive feedback, which, constructive criticism, because that's a real gift I found throughout my career that I've been very fortunate to have as mentors, people who were honest, who actually cared about my development enough to tell me those areas that I needed to do better in. And that, looking back on that, those were some of the most important things. And then I think the last thing I would say, and it seems a little incongruous, is that if you're going to be successful, you have to be willing to fail at some point in your life. Because if you're unwilling to take risk, and risk entails the potential of failure, then you're really sort of reducing the parameters of what success is possible. So those are just a few things that just occurred to me. I must say that when people ask you those kinds of questions about leadership and how you become successful in the world, that's really a sign, Janice, that I've gotten really old.
Never. We are just reinventing ourselves, Ken. Believe me, it is you are. You're on another trajectory, and as co-chair of OneTen and former CEO and chair of Merck, you have done so much good in this world that I know we're going to hear many more stories from you. And I wanted to just add that, you are one of those leaders that has stood up and spoken out appropriately on so many very controversial issues. And I've always said that, the best leaders it starts at the top with great character, that moral compass, that integrity. We admire you for what you have done and what you will continue to do. So thank you so much for taking the time today to join us with your incredible story and wise words and just guidance for all of us.
Well, thank you, Janice, for your generous opportunity here to speak and for all the kind comments you've made during the course of this interview.
And thank you to our audience, yes, for tuning in to another game-changing conversation on Leadership Reimagined. You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or visit our website at elliggroup.com. Thank you, Ken Frazier, for joining us today, and thank you to our audience.